So what are bats? So bats are flying mammals. They're the only true flying mammal that there are in the world. They are categorized in the order of Chiroptera or Chiroptera, which translate into Latin and ancient Greek as hand wing. They're then further divided into two major groups. So you've got the Megachiroptera or megabats. So they're your fruit bats, flying foxes, which we don't get in the UK. We've then got Microchiroptera or microbats. But obviously these names can be a little bit misleading because some of the megabats are actually quite small and some of the microbats are actually quite big. So just in the pictures here, none of these are UK species for any eagle-eyed people there. So we've got an Indian flying fox, which is one of the bigger species. But then you've got a spotted wing fruit bat, which you get in New Zealand, which is then only 5 to 6 centimeters in terms of head to body, in terms of size. So it's a big bat. It's a mega bat, but it's actually quite small. And then we've got microbats that can be quite big. So this is a false vampire bat or lesser false vampire bat. They tend to weigh somewhere around 25 grams. Whereas you've then got a little forest bat, which can be anywhere down to 3 grams and quite small. So you've got that range in sort of the bats in terms of their morphology. So yeah, mega doesn't always mean you're going to see a big bat. Difference between the species. So all the mega bats, they won't echolocate. So they'll find food with their eyes. So they tend to eat fruit, other sort of small mammals, insects, all that kind of stuff. But they'll see. They don't tend to use echolocation to hunt, whereas all of the microbats, they're not blind, they can see, they will use their eyes, but they will hunt and find insects and prey using echolocation. So that's your main difference. So if anyone's walked through Chester Zoo's bat cave with a bat detector and not heard anything, they're all Megachiroptera, so they don't make any echolocation. So that's why you don't hear anything like that. In the UK, we've got 18 species of bat, 17 of which are known to be breeding. Which is a quarter of the UK's mammal species. So they make up a large proportion of the mammals that we get in the UK. In Britain, all bat species and their roosts are legally protected by both domestic and international legislation. So that's the Wildlife and Countryside Act 1981 amended. And then you've got the Conservation and Habitat Regulations, which is the EU legislation, but a post-Brexit version of that. That also means they're European protected species as well, all bat species in the UK. So deliberate to take, injure or kill a wild bat, recklessly disturb its roost or a group of bats, damage a resting place are used for breeding or resting, even if the bat's not in the roost at the time. To possess, advertise, sell or exchange a bat species in the wild, dead or alive, or even part of a bat. And then intentionally or actually obstruct access to a bat roost. Now, some of these you can do if you are licensed by Natural England, Nature Scot, Natural Resources Wales, depending on where you are in Great Britain. They'll give you what's called either a derogation license to go against this legislation or a specific survey license to use certain techniques that would otherwise either disturb bats or things like that. So you would need a license to do that. So the 17 or 18 species that we get in the UK, they can be grouped. They're all listed here. So you've got your pipistrelle bats, so they are common, soprano, and Nethusius pipistrelle. You've got your long-eared bats, so your brown and your grey long-eared. Your horseshoe bats, so greater, lesser horseshoe. And then we get into a group which we tend to group together called Myotis species. So that's the Latin name Myotis, which translates as mouse-eared bats. So we then have our mouse-eared bats, which are the Alcathoe, Becksteins, Brants, Dobentons, Naturas, Whiskered. There's then the Barbastole bat, the Lyslers, and the Noctule bat, which are a similar species of a bigger bat in the UK. Serotine bat, and then the greater mouse-eared bat, which is the non-breeding one, which I think there's 2 individuals down on the south coast, but they're both the individuals that are regularly seen are both female, so not breeding in the UK. The colour coding here, white species you'd expect to find and see and hear within North Merseyside. The orange ones we have some very sporadic, maybe not verifiable records of within North Merseyside. And then the blue ones we don't really get. They're specifically either a specific habitat that we don't really get around here. So the Becksteins is a typical woodland bat, which is only found in a lot of ancient woodland, which tends to be further south. Serotine bats we do get, but not in great numbers. And not towards, we haven't really got many records in North Merseyside. There's odd records across Lancashire, down into Derbyshire, Shropshire. So that's sort of where they would come up to. And then there was a vague record of a Barbastell bat, but I don't think that individual was actually seen as a physical bat. It was potentially something that was heard and misidentified.
It was found in.
Oh, was it? Was it a boot or Barbastell? Was it actually the actual bat? Was it? Oh, was it? Oh, okay. Well,
taken to care and then.
Okay. So there we go. So yeah, then there's the boot or Barbastell. So that one singular one, but it's not something that you would expect, especially on the docks in Bootle. Oh, really? Okay. So they're the species we get in the UK. So top left, we've got Soprano pipistrelle. This one here is a greater horseshoe bat. We've then got a Natterer's bat and a brown long-eared bat, but I'll go through some more identification stuff with you in a bit. So into a bit of the ecology. So the life cycle of a bat can be sort of split into different periods. I tend to split it into 4. Some people will maybe go a bit more closer in on that. At the moment, we're in what I would call the emergence period for bats. The bats have emerged from hibernation, sort of depending on the weather, that may be into March, more likely April and into the start of May. So they come out of hibernation, they've come out of torpor, the weather's warmed up and been more consistent temperatures and not been too cold overnight when they would typically be flying. And basically they're looking to feed up, gain some more body weight post hibernation. Around this time as well, the females, having stored sperm over winter, having mated before hibernation, will release that when the temperature, the humidity, the weather conditions are at their most stable. So sort of April into May, to allow then that gestation period before going into maternity roosts from May through to August. So once we then get into the maternity period, which is sort of the next few weeks onwards, bats will come together. The females will gather together in what we call maternity roosts. The males, you may get the odd few together, but they'll tend to roost either singularly or you might get small sort of bachelor roosts, as some people might put it. You may get small clusters of bats together, but not in the volume that you would get for a maternity colony of females. The females will have 1 pup per year. There are cases of twins, but it will mainly be 1 pup per female. And they join together in these maternity roosts, so they sort of act like a nursery or creche. Essentially, once the pups are at a certain stage, they can either stay together or there's a few adult bats around, so the females can still go out and forage and feed while they're supporting a pup. The pups are fed on milk. They start off very small, and they'll be blind, and then in a few days they'll be able to see and move around. They're very velvety to start off with. Their fur's not fully in yet, so it'll take that a while for that to become fully furred up, put weight on from the milk from the mother, before they can then get to a point where they can fly attached to the female. And then once they get bigger and they can put enough weight on to actually then learn to fly themselves. And then you'll get a period where you have females leaving the roost and going to forage. You'll then have juveniles as well. They're usually a little bit clumsy, so that's the point where we get a lot of bats in care that are juvenile bats, because it's first flights out. They're not used to this. They're trying to fatten up. They're maybe not strong enough to fly. And get bats in care around sort of June time into July. I think the earliest baby that I had sight of in care last year was the end of the first week in June, which is quite early. I don't know whether in other places they've had them any earlier than that, but everything is shifting forward in terms of when you specifically see babies where roosts have been impacted, and then the juveniles following on from that. Roosts will start to break up in sort of August time before the bats then obviously head to their swarming sites. So the swarming period tends to be sort of late August, September, October as those main periods for swarming. So bats will use those swarming sites to mate. So you'll get usually a lot of horny males, I will say, flying around screaming, or in trees screaming for bats and things like that, trying to attract females. You'll then get swarming sites where bats will get a lot of social calling and things like that, and then that's when the mating will occur. Across North Merseyside, I don't think there's a lot in terms of known big swarming sites that we're aware of. More research would need to be done there, and things. It's certain conditions that would favour swarming gatherings of bats and things. Proximity to roosts, proximity to hibernation roosts, the conditions that the bats can fly into to mate. The female, as I say, then stores that sperm, so she'll mate in the autumn, store that throughout into hibernation. So we call it hibernation period, but it's not a typical hibernation that you would expect from other mammals. So bats will go into something called torpor, which is basically they'll reduce their body's activity, their metabolism, everything down as far as possible to stay in sort of a stable state for the winter. So they'll reduce everything down. Oh, sorry. Curses on the wrong page. Yeah, so they'll go into that, but if we get a mild winter or particularly mild days, bats will come out of that state and they'll go and drink. If it's particularly warm and you do get some of the insects that have gone into their sort of hibernation roosts flying, they may feed on them, but typically they'll probably drink, move around to another place within that roost, not really be active for long periods of time in that mild weather, but they will become active if the weather's warm. Typically in their hibernation roost, they're looking for like stable temperatures, humidity, so they're not going to lose as much moisture. So they can the humid environment means they're not going to evaporate moisture from their body. So they tend to be places like caves, tunnels for some of the larger bats, trees. So there's some species that will only roost in trees throughout the summer and the winter. Buildings, some use the same building throughout summer and throughout winter. And they just want that stable temperature, which will then take them through from sort of November time through to March, and then again into emergence. So it's got this sort of life cycle approach. So where the bats live. So bats lives in roosts. They don't live in nests or anything like that. Call them roosts. Bats will roost, and they can either roost singly or they can roost in a group. So as we say, around maternity season, bats will come together. Other times they might be individuals. And certain species will tend to prefer certain places. So this is a nocturnal bat. It's one of the biggest bats we get in the UK. We sort of call it a 4-finger bat. If you lay it across your hand, it would fit into your palm across there. Quite a wide wingspan. They tend to solely be a tree dwelling species for their roosts. So they'll either go into sort of woodpecker holes, something with bigger cavities that they can get into, and they'll roost in there. You'll hear them as well at different times of year calling throughout the mating period from these tree roosts that they've got. There'll be a male in there trying to attract a female in. We then got a lesser horseshoe. So horseshoe bats are the only free hanging bat that we get in the UK, and there are two species, the greater and the lesser horseshoe. Horseshoe because they have this horseshoe shaped nose flap on their face, which is used for their echolocation. This is a boiler room, which I surveyed in North Wales, and this is a room that is used both during summer maternity and throughout hibernation. So they will stay in the same sites if they're suitable conditions. They just move to different places. So in the summer, they're right by where all the hot water pipes are to make that nice and cozy throughout the maternity period. And in the winter, they're right at the other end, and probably the coldest, more humid part of the roost, which is going to keep a more stable temperature. It was in an old school, so obviously if the radiators are in the school, part of it's going to be quite warm. The other side of it, separate from the actual boiler and things, obviously a lot cooler, used in hibernation. Most bats, or the majority of the bat species that we get in the UK, they will roost in buildings. Different bats have different preferences for those types of roosts, but they will roost in buildings as well. And then trees and bat boxes. So there are many different types of bat box. You'll probably see loads of different bat boxes around. Some of you maybe have checked bat boxes and seen bats and different things. This was one I checked that was stuffed full of brown long-eared bats. There's a nice photo there. But yeah, most of the species that we get that will either creving or some void-dwelling species as well will use bat boxes. Different boxes are suitable for different species of bats. And you'll get some bats using a box that you think, oh, actually, is that a bit tight for you to be in? But they will use that as well. So just looking more specifically towards buildings and trees, these are the sort of places that you would expect to find a bat or could find a bat. So within buildings, you can see there are numerous features that bats will use. So they'll use barge boards, softened boxes, bits of roofing felt that are open and allow access, underneath roof tiles, and the actual main loft space itself. There's certain species that will use the void, and then other species that will use the crevices within the building. So your pipistrelles will be a crevice dwelling species, and they'll use the crevices within the building. Things like your brown long-eared bats that need time to sort of fly, they'll tend to use the voids, but then perch on the wooden timbers and things like that, and they'll go in there, but then they have space to fly. Cladding within the eaves, guttering, windowsills, anything that they can sort of get into that's going to give them a nice sort of sheltered space that they can stay nice and dry and warm in the summer, cooler in the winter. Within trees, trees have loads of functions for bats, but yeah, cracks and crevices within the trunks, woodpecker holes, behind loose bark. And now that's not sort of just a loose bit of bark, but where you've got like a bit of bark that's lifted off and it's sort of created a nice crevice behind it. We'll get bats in there. Occasionally, you might get some bats using dense ivy, but it's more that the ivy covers another feature that the bat can get into, and then the ivy provides that shelter. They'll also use them as sort of a feeding perch. So some bats will take their prey and then go and actually perch to digest to eat and start digesting it. Other ones will catch prey on the wing. So yeah, buildings and trees massively important for bats. In my line of work, they're the things that I'm checking in terms of reports coming in, obviously mostly to do with development. It's what features are there on that building that are suitable for bats, and that can be scored in terms of a potential for bat roost to be present, and then surveys following on from that to actually decide whether bats are present or not, and then that will then provide mitigation for those roosts or compensation as well, as part of the mitigation hierarchy for those schemes. So obviously we've talked about where bats live. We're going to talk about what bats eat. So all of the UK bats eat insects. Each one will have its own preference for what type of insect that they'll go for. So brown long-eared bats prefer, or they have a preference for yellow underwing moths. So you'll usually see a collection of moth wings below a feeding perch or a roost for brown long-eared bats. Whereas your pipistrelles they will feed on midges. So they're great for pest control. If you've got a bat box up and you've got a known roost and you sat out in the garden, you'll probably get them flying around because they're eating all the midges. And I don't know where this figure came from, and who counted, and how they got to this figure, but apparently a single common pipistrelle can eat over 3,000 midges in a single night, which is not. It's not. I wouldn't say that. I say that's probably quite accurate. They're a small bat, fast metabolism, constantly darting around. They need a lot of sustenance. They eat small things, and they eat a lot of them. As I say, with the feeding perches, so most insects are caught and eaten in flight, but bats will sometimes find it easier to hang up somewhere to eat larger prey. But yeah, big appetites. Flying uses a lot of energy, so they need to feed up throughout the night and throughout the periods of their activity. So how do they catch this prey? So obviously we talked about before, between the megabats and the microbats, bats will use echolocation to target in on that prey. So bats aren't blind, so they can use their eyes. They'll move around. They use that to navigate within their roost when they've gone in there, and they can see. But their eyes aren't as good as their ears. So they'll make a shouting sort of ultrasonic shout that they'll send out, and then they hear the echo back, and then they're able to work out where that object is in relation to them, and sort of use that to navigate as well, to map areas and actually figure out, okay, where am I and what's flying through my path as I'm flying around, and how close they are to an insect. So it's the equivalent of, and I'm sorry for this, me walking towards you and going, "Oi!" and then listening to it like that. "Oi!" and then see it's coming back to me quicker. "Oi!" and then I get closer to you again. And when I get so close to you that those echoes are coming back faster than an audible sound, when we listen to bats on a bat detector, you'll hear like a raspberry sounding sound, which is basically that noise has gone too fast to register as a separate noise. And that's the point where the bats have caught something, and that's when so the echolocation goes out, the waves are emitted, and they bounce back quicker and quicker and quicker and quicker, and then they'll have their prey. So yeah, it basically gives them the proximity to what they're feeding on, but they can also use it as well to sort of map out where they are. Certain bats will have different frequencies depending on and different types of sounds depending on what their habitat preferences are, what their species preferences are in terms of what they eat. They'll all eat insects, so they need to look for places with lots of them in order to hunt for their prey. So some bats will prefer waterways, others prefer woods, grasslands. The habitat choice can be species specific, and some bats will travel a reasonable distance from their roosts in order to get the right prey. In urban environments, so obviously in North Merseyside, we have a fairly urban concentration, as well as other areas that don't. That give us that sort of more suburban to countryside. So bats will obviously roost in buildings, but then they'll forage in green spaces, gardens, allotments, parks, cemeteries, anywhere with like a nice woodland block, or a good section of grassland, or where we've got brooks, canals, things that give them somewhere where insects will be attracted to. And obviously some insects are attracted to street lighting, so our more light tolerant species you'll see foraging around street lamps and things because prey is attracted to it, so the bats will be attracted to it as well. In terms of navigating their habitat, bats are also adapted for flying, as well as their echolocation to map themselves around things. So we discussed before, the bats, the Chiroptera, it means hand wing, which basically means that they're a true flying mammal. They can use those wings to actually gain height, change direction, and truly fly. But they're adapted for flight, which means that they can be very flexible and move independently. So a bat's wing is similar to my hand, essentially. They'll have 5 fingers, which is essentially a thumb and 4 fingers, but we call the thumb the first finger rather than just the thumb, or we go thumb, second, third, fourth, fifth, in terms of how that is there. So essentially, that's my hand, and I can move these independently to change height, to change direction, to flap, and bats' wings are different shapes depending on, most of the time, their habitat or roost preferences, where they need to get to and from and hunt. So you can see here, we discussed obviously different habitats that they'll use. So brown long-eared bats usually fly very close to trees. So they'll sort of have more of a fluttering than a darting around. So they've basically got to glean their prey from the trees. So they need to move slower in order to pick up that prey and go. So their echolocation is probably less about catching bats in flight and more about seeing where those moths are on leaves on the trees or on the bark and things like that. Whereas something like a pipistrelle have a very erratic, they'll fly everywhere, twisting and turning around buildings, streetlights, trees, hedges, because they've got to catch the best part of 3,000 midges in a night. Midges are this big, and they do this. So the pipistrelle needs to be adapted to actually get that as well. But that maneuverability, like obviously bats, it makes them better at flying than birds, essentially, in terms of what they can do and how they can get the places they can get to. So they're more adapted to their niche of flying in certain areas than some birds. So I've got some main points. Most of this information is taken from the Bat Conservation Trust website. So if you do want to look at anything again, or you want more detailed information of any of these species, if you go on the BCT website, bat species, and it lists all 17. I actually got the 18th one as well, and there's loads of information you can get for disseminating those out. So pipistrelles, small bats. So head to body length are somewhere between 3.5 and 4 centimeters. In terms of where they'll typically live, pipistrelle bats will use buildings, they'll use trees. Soprano pipistrelle probably has more of a preference to more vegetated habitats, although we do get large numbers of bats roosting in buildings as well. Not much really to distinguish between them in terms of their colour. So colour is not usually something that we tend to use to identify specific bat species, although for some it's quite clear. Between these two, both medium to dark brown. Face and around the eyes usually dark in colour for the common pipistrelle. So this one we would nickname, or a lot of people nickname, the bandit bat, because it sort of has a dark band and a lot of darker muzzle. Whereas you can see the soprano pipistrelle, it is dark, but it has got pinker features and it has a much pinker underside to the muzzle as well. And face and around the eyes usually more like a pinker in colour. The common pipistrelle, wide range of habitats, woodland, hedgerow, grassland, farmland, suburban and urban areas, whereas the soprano, wetter habitats over lakes and rivers, woodland edge, tree lines, hedgerows, suburban parks and gardens. So you can already see there's a habitat overlap there. They're both very similar bats in terms of the way they fly, the things they eat, where they live. So how do we figure out which bat you've got? So typically, if you've got bats in the hand, there's a few things you can do. These keys are great in terms of you've got bats in the hand, but the majority of you, bar a few select people, it's rare you're going to get a bat in the hand. So that's why I've not focused on this, but the information's there. We tend to use their echolocation, so the peak frequency of their echolocation calls, which I'll go on to more in terms of listening to bats in a second. The peak frequency of a call for a common pipistrelle is 45 kilohertz, whereas a soprano pipistrelle is 10 kilohertz higher, or 10,000 kilohertz higher, so 55 kilohertz, which essentially means that if you've got a bat detector, they'll sound very different if you've got the wrong bat at the wrong frequency, which we'll get onto. But that's one of the main indicators when we've got bats flying around us that we can use to identify them. Cool. We've then got the brown long-eared bat. So medium-sized, with ears nearly as long as the body. Now I'm going to make you all do something now. If you can all put your hands above your head, like this. You're a brown long-eared bat. This is how long your ears would be. Okay. So just to put that into perspective between their body size and their ears are very big. So if you see one of them, it's not going to look like anything else because it's got really, really big ears. So yeah, that's the brown long-eared bat. Again, sort of 3.7 to 5.2 centimeters. Sometimes that can include the ears if it's a juvenile. So just obviously looking for adult bats. But again, bigger than a pipistrelle bat, really, really long ears. Feed in a wide range of sort of woodland edge habitats. As I said before, they'll glean the insects off the leaves and the bark, much more of a fluttery flight. And yeah, much more bigger ears. So sometimes you'll see the silhouette of these long ears and this fluttery bat, and you'll think, oh, it's like a brown long-eared bat. Probably right. We've then got the nocturnal bat. So this is the one we saw before. Quite a big bat, roosts most commonly in trees. It's rare that they're found sort of nocturnal roosts anywhere else. Head and body length, 8.4 to 10.4 centimeters. So much, much bigger, chunkier bat. You'd know if you find one. They're very, very big bat. They fly in the open, often really, really high up above the tree line. They're probably one of the higher flying species. They're getting the bigger, higher flying moths, things like that. They're flying at that height. Sometimes with sort of steep dives to their flight, but you'll see them. Sometimes you'll see something and think, oh, that looks like a bird, but actually it's not. It's a bat. They're flying at that sort of height and that sort of flight. It's just a bird that looks like it's flying a bit weird, and that could be a bat. Then we get into our Myotis species. So I've started off with the two sort of middle-sized ones. So you've got the Daubenton's bat and you've got the Natura's bat. So Daubenton's, this one here, reddy brown with pale underneath. So typically Myotis bats, when you see them in the hand, their ventral and dorsal fur, so their back and their front fur, is a different colour and will contrast. And it's differing shades of white or cream depending on which bat you've got. So for the Daubentons, sort of pinkish face, bare around the eyes, pale underneath, and then they're sort of, it says reddish brown. That one doesn't look reddish brown, so it could just be a thing. It could just be the photograph, could be a variation in that particular bat. They're nicknamed the water bat. So typically Daubentons will forage over water. Then they've got massive back feet. They've got massive feet, and they'll use that for grabbing insects off the water surface, or either really close to the water surface or from the water itself. Whereas the Natura's bat, light buff brown to black, but very pale underneath, and a very distinctive change in white. So it's almost here, and they sort of have a halo of lighter hair behind their ears. So it's very white on the front, longer ears than the Daubenton's bat, and they have a flick backwards. So they come forward and they flick back on the Natura's bat. Again, pink face, but should be completely bare, whereas obviously this is probably got some fur around it, which is quite bare around the eyes, but the muzzle's still quite bare on this one. Natura is typically very bare muzzle and face. Very similar in body length, these two, so 4 to 5 centimeters, 4.5 to 5.5 centimeters, sort of medium size bat. Your pipistrelles are sort of body size of your thumb. These are a bit bigger, they'll properly sit in your hand, and then the nocturnal obviously a lot bigger than that. Peak frequency 45 to 50 and 50. So actually there's quite a bit of overlap there in terms of the echolocation, but we'll get on to actually sound them in a second. Natura is much slower flight, typically than the Daubentons, sometimes over water, but most often within trees. Quite broad wings and tailwinds. They've got really good maneuverability at a slower speed, so they can navigate woodlands a bit more. Headlines into woodland, going into woodland, into the canopy as well for the foraging that they'll do. Then we've got what we call the small Myotis species. So I focused on the two that we could get around here. There are some records of Alcathoe, but they would need to be verified. So we have the Brandt's bat, which is this one here, and we have the whiskered bat. Small bat with dark brown, slightly shaggy fur. Looks pretty shaggy to me. Fur becomes brighter with light golden tips as they get older. 3.8 to 5 centimeters, quite a bit of variation in body size. Peak frequency of 45 kilohertz. Rapid, skillful flight, often within woodlands, but they may pick their prey off foliage and often near the water. So this is where you start to see that there's a lot of these bats that will overlap in terms of their habitats and things like that. Whiskered bat, shaggy dark grey fur. Well, that one's got slightly shaggy fur as well. So which one are you going to have? Face dark and dark ears. It's quite dark, isn't it? So sometimes bats in the hand can be quite difficult to identify, but for you guys, probably not going to have many bats in the hand. Fast and a bit more fluttering flight, level with occasional swoops. They'll sometimes glide if they're feeding in the canopy, so rather than just flitting around, they'll sort of glide through. But they'll tend to fly a more regular route, so they'll have a more wrapped out route in terms of bats that you hear. If you sort of hear it once, and you'll hear it over and over again in terms of a whiskered bat foraging preferences. So in terms of these species across North Merseyside, having looked at what bats eat, where they live, what kind of bats we get, the overlap within their sort of ecological niches, where their habitat is, what they eat, and all that kind of stuff, we then start to build a picture of what that distribution looks like across North Merseyside. So this is all of the bat species records to a 1 kilometre grid square, 2 kilometre grid square. I think it's 2 kilometre grid square. So it's quite coarse. So there will be multiple records within these squares, but it just shows you that across North Merseyside, we get bats pretty much everywhere. There's a select few places where we haven't got records. That's just because we haven't got people potentially sending them in. So yeah, in terms of the distribution of all bat species across North Merseyside, pretty much wherever you are, you could go out with a bat detector and get some of the species that we've talked about. Pipistrelles. So common, soprano. There is an enthusiast pipistrelle, but it's much bigger, slightly different features, characteristics. Tend to prefer a lot more sort of wetter areas and things like that. Not so much in the distribution across North Merseyside, which I've not really mentioned it, but it is a bat that can pop up from time to time. Within the sort of ID stuff and the habitat stuff, we talked about common pipistrelles potentially preferring more urban environments. Soprano pipistrelles potentially liking more woodland, water, those kind of preferences in terms of their roost and foraging. And there's sort of a trend in terms of that, in terms of the numbers that we get. Now, one thing to mention on this data, I haven't specified a time range. And up until the mid-90s, they were just pipistrelles. So actually, some of these records of common pipistrelle could be soprano pipistrelle. Some of these records of soprano pipistrelle could be common pipistrelle. They've been verified as best they could, but obviously there is a time period where we just called them pipistrelle bats. It wasn't until they started to look at the DNA, the echolocation, all that kind of stuff, and actually these are two very different bats in terms of the distribution of common and soprano pipistrelles. I've paired these together just because they were on previous slides together, because we don't get the grey long-eared bat in North Merseyside, we only get the brown, and we don't get very many Leisler's bats. Again, sparse records, but could be misidentified, haven't been fully verified. So just focused on the nocturnal. So brown long-eared bat, woodland edge, gleaning their prey, sort of concentrations around some of the bigger estates and things that there are in North Merseyside, getting out into more of the more, well, you got records around urban places, so this will be more in terms of bigger open warehouse buildings, loft voids, things like that, places they can go and roost, they can fly, they've got the right food source there. Some of the main parks you get across Merseyside into Holton, Knowsley, St Helens, and then up the coast, getting more into sort of the bigger, older estates, bigger buildings, nice big timber framed loft voids, things like that, but still providing those habitat preferences for them as well. Nocturals, these are a mixture of roosts and sightings and hearing bats as well. If you think of nocturals that very high flying can cover a long distance, some of these records will be the same bat in terms of how far they've gone from that roost to forage, because they're foraging way up there. They've probably covered more ground than you think before they've come back to roost. One thing I didn't mention before, which I'm just remembering now because I didn't see it on my notes, in terms of bats roosting, they'll move around throughout the year to the different roost types, whether it's summer for maternity or hibernation. Some will stay in the same roost, but they'll also move roosts by night, by week, by every few weeks, based on conditions of that particular roost at the time, the aspect that that faces, changes in sunset and sunrise times in terms of how warm that roost gets, how cool that roost can be. If a squirrel's got in and wrecked it, then they might move somewhere else. If it's a tree roost, if it's a roost that they would normally go to and there's bees in it now, because it's sometimes can be a case of who gets there first. Bats will move around more regularly. So again, some of the records that we've got in the distribution could be roosts that are moving as well. So we've got these distribution patterns, but they could essentially, some of them be the same roosts depending on when throughout the year they've been recorded. So a maternity roost in one area, it's then broken up, those bats could then be split into multiple roosts somewhere else, and then those records carry on. But we factor that in, and actually there's a healthy population of bats, although they are strictly protected and numbers are down. Across Merseyside, there are numbers of bats at the moment, but obviously everything's still declining based on the other part of my job. Dubentons and natterers, I would have expected probably more records of natterers. But the records that Biobank have provided, there's only sort of key areas where we're recording natterers bats. But that could just be that we're getting the same people recording them in the same places for a lot of these records. In terms of the Daubenton's, you could probably make a very, very informed guess that most of these records are over a body of water or in close proximity to a body of water, which is obviously their main foraging resource. Natter is a bit different. Some of these records will be in hibernation, so bats that have been found in hibernation roosts as opposed to bats calling or seen in flight. So in order to get a lot of this data, we need to survey for bats. So as I said before, they're all protected. There are certain things you can do to disturb bats, which means you can then see all of the stuff that we've just talked about. But most of the time, the thing you don't need a license for is recording bats and recording their sound and identifying them that way. So we will use a heterodyne bat detector, typically. Looks slightly different to this in that they don't have a screen, but we've got some which we'll share out when we go on the bat walk in a second. Essentially, these bat detectors have a range of frequencies that they can, and a microphone that listens to that and then plays it back through a speaker and converts the echolocation sound into an audible sound that we can hear. So our hearing range is much lower than the frequency that a bat will echolocate at. So what this does is it converts that to an audible sound that we can hear. So we'll hear that in terms of a pattern of either clicks or more of like a warble for certain types of species and things. And the pattern, the frequency and the tone of that, plus the peak frequency, which we've mentioned before, will be what we can use to identify that bat. So in terms of the peak frequency, that is the point within the call that it's lowest and deepest and clearest part of the call. So if you think, so this is a pipistrelle call here. So this is what I was saying about frequency modulated calls. There's a large range of frequency that they'll call at. But this nice dark hockey stick shape here, 47, 45, between 45 and 50 peak frequency for common pipistrelle bat. You'll hear that as loudest sound to the call on your bat detector. If you're hearing that and it sounds a bit tinny, and you scroll your bat detector up to 55 kilohertz, and you then hear that nice deep tone of the bat call, it's more likely you've got soprano pipistrelle than you've got a common pipistrelle. And that's how we can use that to get the different species through our call. And bats seen in flight and echolocating mainly between April and October, so that emergence through to hibernation period. Sometimes if bats are disturbed through hibernation, you might see on a particularly mild day, and you may see bats flying in the daylight within winter as well. If there are insects out, then they would obviously echolocate then as well. But the main time to hear bats will be between April and October. So there's 5 calls I'm going to play you. I'd like you to form your own mental description of how you think it sounds. These are the main ones in terms of how people are trained, or how people we say this is what it sounds like. So we talk about wet smacks or slaps, quiet ticks, dry clicks, a chip chop sound, crackling, like an audible warble, something that sounds really sci-fi and like scientific in terms of the horseshoe bats, which I'm not going to show you, but they do sound pretty cool. So yeah, as I play these, if you can sort of form your own image and then form your own description and see how it lines up with the ones that are on here. Let's just check that sound on. Oh, I'm not playing.
Playing this.
Playing on that, but not on the TV.
That, yeah.
Oh, maybe my sound's muted on here then. There we go. So this is a call of common or soprano pipistrelle, but obviously you scroll up or down where you hear that call at its loudest, will then tell you which of the 2 species that you've got. Yeah. Everyone happy with that? Yeah. You going to do that outside now? Yeah. Okay. So we say a wet, smack, or slap. So you can. When I play another one in a minute, the call will sound very wet as opposed to dry. But essentially, it's that slapping sound together in quite a repetitive. It's not too irregular. It's quite regular, but then there are fluctuations, and you hear the feeding buzz in there as well. So if I play it again, you can hear the point where that bat has got hold of something. There. So it goes to that staticky raspberry sound. So that's basically the sound coming through this that has got to a point where those echolocations are very, very close together, and it makes that noise. So hearing that sound, knowing the habitat that they're in and how they fly and they dart around, they just sound a bit mad, don't they? They're sort of darting around. They've got this wet sort of pattern to their call. They're darting around. So that would be your pipistrelles. And like I say, when you tune your detector, depending on where you hear the sound, you'll hear it. Now, I'm going to play the Daubenton's next, because this is where you'll hear your difference between your dry and your wet sounds. Yeah, much drier, more like a snare drum kind of sound as opposed to like a wet slap. Pardon?
Machine gun.
Machine gun, yeah. So this is what I was saying. If you form your own description in your head, you're more likely to then associate those different sounds or something. If someone stood there going, "Oh, it sounds like this," and you're like, "Doesn't sound like that." Form your own thing, but these are the main things that you're listening out for. So with the Daubenton's, repetition. So it's the actual pattern of the call. You've got sort of a pulse and then a pulse and then a bit where it gets something, but it's much, much drier. But again, they'll have that frequency modulated call that goes through lots of different ranges of kilohertz, but you're getting that nice deep sound, probably between 35 and 45. The difference between the Myotis species of the Daubenton's and the pipistrelles and some of the other ones that you'll hear now is that call should sound the same at most frequencies, but it'll sound its clearest between 35 and 45. So those dry clicks, even if you're somewhere around sort of 40 or 50, if it's that much drier sound, it's going to be some sort of Myotis species that you've got. The scrolling, you shouldn't get much of a change. You'll just get a change in sort of the loudness and the clearness of the call as you get down to sort of this 35, 40, between 35 and 40 kilohertz, in terms of that dry click. Now, brown long-eared bats, if you remember this, their call is very quiet and it's sort of a ticking, well, they say ticking. I think it sounds like a very quiet Geiger counter type sound to me. So that's sort of, you're just starting to get to a bit of radiation and you might want to turn back a bit. That's the sort of sound that I go for in terms of a brown long-eared bat, but very, very quiet. And that's a very clear call. If you're hearing that, and that bat's going to be above your head, if you're hearing it that clearly with a bat detector, you're less likely to sort of hear it that close. It might be quite a quiet call that comes out, but it's sort of that pattern, and quite short calls as well. It won't be sort of long calls, short calls, because they can hear it so easily. It's essentially more of a whisper because they can hear so much. Because if they were to, because of where they are going to and they're not really darting around, they want that more focus on, I'm going for this particular insect on this tree. So they can send that band back, but then they can hear more and they can obviously get that clearer picture as well as they're sending stuff out. And then finally,
Could we just do that one again?
yeah, of course I can. So you've got your Daubenton's, loud, dry, much deeper, very dry. This again, quieter, much more. So if you think nice fluttery flight, I'm going for this thing, quiet call, doesn't need anything more than that. And then the nocturnal bat, nothing else is going to sound like this. I still go for the chip chop sound. You may form your own word in your head, but again, it sounds very different. So yeah, you've got that kind of noise. You've got the chip and the chop noise. So these are bats that much lower frequency. So the lower the frequency, the longer the call will travel in terms of short bursts. So nocturals, high flying, not much clutter around them. They'll sound slightly differently in clutter. So if you have got nocturals at the tops of trees and things, the repetition might get closer together. So you may just get some of the chips or some of the chops. Whereas if this is nice, commuting, flying, easy calls, deep calls, looking out for sort of big moths and things that they can get to, so they can go and do it, and then they might then do that big swoop to get hold of something. So the reason I picked these is these are probably the most common ones that we could hear when we go out, and the most common ones that if you've got a bat detector that you will probably hear. One thing I've not done is put any. So there's a lot of different bat detectors you can get. Heterodyne ones, fairly cheap. They used to make them out of old radios and things like that, and parts of that to put them all together to convert that sound, so they can take the frequencies and turn it into sound. So you used to use sort of old radios for that. You get newer ones now. So I have one that plugs into my phone. So it just basically plugs into the bottom of your phone. It's got a microphone in the end, and between this and the software on my phone, it can convert that into audible sound. Now, what this also does is it gives you the oscilloscope graph of that call as well. So there are ways that you can use those calls to actually look at the shape of the call, how much of the band it calls. I've not focused on that because we could spend hours talking about that, and you can spend years learning about it. If you do want to get into that call ID, this is a really good book to do it with. It basically walks you through it. You need a little bit of knowledge already in terms of using a bat detector, what kind of accident you can get, but it'll give you all the graphs and measurements you can take and what the calls look like and where the peak frequencies are and things like that. It can do everything. You can take it abroad and do all sorts of stuff. If you do look at getting one of these, you have to turn on the British bats, because sometimes you'll get calls and it'll give you something that you've never been hearing before. The only thing I would say to watch out for in terms of these and some of the other software is there's an auto ID function on it. Now, the auto ID isn't as knowledgeable of the fact that everything we've talked about, there's a lot of overlap and a lot of variation. And depending on where you are in the UK, it might record something and then it goes, oh, it's this. We don't get that around. What are we getting that for? The amount of serotine bats I get on this and things like that in an area where it's rare to get those kind of bats. So you sort of have to have a bit of looking into it as well. What you hear, so like training your ears, those word associations with those kind of calls, learning the calls, the flight patterns, what the habitat is around you, where you are in the country, and things like that. Then you could probably go away and look at the graph of the call as well and look at that. It'll all piece together your knowledge and actually identifying what that bat is. And then once you've got all that information, then put it into iRecord or iNaturalist or wherever, and you send it into the local record centre, and then those maps get a lot more clear on where the maps are. So yeah, there are other things you can do. There's also other automatic bat detectors you get. There's static bat detectors that you can leave out. There's some that this big little audio moth things that you can leave out, and then you'd have to run them through software. Bigger things like that, Anabats, all sorts of things. Loads of software out there for bats. Yeah, they're brilliant. So that essentially you just built this.
And during lockdown. But when we do bat walks at work, we tell the parents to buy one of those instead.
Yeah, they're great.
25 quid.
And they're great. So all that is just that it's an FM module that can produce the sound, and you end up with that small scope of what you're tuning it to, and you'll easily be able to either get it to it's this pipistrelle species, it's a nocturnal. You'll struggle with meiotis because there's different things you're going to have to do. They all sound fairly similar and different, but the kids, fantastic. Yeah, ideal. These ones are good. They're very clear. They pick up all the UK species. Quite clear. I think these are £80 on Amazon. These are sort of somewhere between 250.
Finally came back into stock recently.
Yeah, 250, £300, things like that. And again, the best way for a sort of from an amateur basis, get out, look for bats, try and listen to bats. Yeah, and go from there. So obviously you're all here because you've got an interest in bats and wanting to know more about it. So I've mentioned Bat Conservation Trust. The Bat Conservation Trust runs the National Bat Monitoring Programme. So again, we're linking this into sort of distribution in terms of records and things like that. So the National Bat Monitoring Programme has been running for quite a few years now. The most available annual report for that is 22. I think the 23 one should be coming out within the next few weeks in terms of what data they've got for the national populations of bats, of all the UK bat species. But they do 5 different survey types. There is a 6th one as well, which I haven't included. And they're things that you can get involved with. So the Sunset Survey is either, like you say, one of these make your own bat detectors, bat detector. You sit out on a particular night within a certain period. You record what you see and you see or hear, and you send that into Bat Conservation Trust. There's a new one which is called Night Watch, which I think they've only launched this year or the last couple of years, which again is if you're level of experience and you've not got much experience with the detector and things like that, it works similarly to the Sunset Survey, but I think it's more about just as and when you see something. It's not a particular period of time we want the records for. It's just you're out at night, you're watching for stuff, and I think it's you're recording bats, and I think there's a few other things that will go in with that as well of other things that you're seeing. You've got roost count surveys. So these typically you would have to know of a roost, and then you would be sitting there, you'd figure out what species you've got, but then you're counting individuals out of that roost. So these roost count ones are typically ones as part of the National Bat Monitoring Programme that local bat groups and things would be involved in. They've got a known roost that they monitor every year. I myself go to quite a lot of these. We do quite a lot in Cheshire, and I do quite a lot in South Lancashire, and obviously the side of West Lancashire Bat Group do ones as well. And then you've got the field survey and the waterfall survey, which are transects. So they're a walked route around a certain place. There are 1 kilometre grid squares on the Bat Conservation Trust website, which you can go and select and have your own site to do it. If you've got experience with a bat detector and you can identify nocturnal, common pipistrelle, soprano pipistrelle, then you can go and do the field surveys. Essentially, it's a walk transect. As you're walking, you're listening out and recording a particular species, so you're not really worried about. You can make notes of what you've got around you, but it's focused on a particular species that you're listening out for. You'll stop at a certain point, and when you're stopped for that period of time, you're listening for a slightly different species. And that's the same on the waterway survey as well. It's a stretch of waterway. It's usually a kilometre walk along a stretch of waterway. This one's a little bit different in that you can use a torch to sort of see bats as well, because you're looking for Dorbentons. So you're looking for bats very, very close to the water. That nice white shine from the bat, how they're getting that. You've got your detector, you know how they sound, and you're doing that. So there's the waterway surveys as well. And you can always join your local bat group. So there's 80 bat groups in the UK. So no matter where you are, you're going to be in close proximity to one or another. If you're in sort of an ecology sector and you're wanting to get into that and you're starting out, you're trying to go for licenses, survey licenses and things, your bat groups are probably one of the main places you're going to get a lot of experience. They may not necessarily be able to act as a reference or specifically provide you with something to get your license, but you'll have opportunity to attend talks, visit roosts, all that kind of stuff, which can then give you experience to go out and do stuff. But yeah, some bat groups are just like 1 or 2 people. Some are really big. I'm going to pause for a minute to just ask Tony to give you a little bit of information about Merseyside and West Lancashire Bat Group, and then I'll go through some questions and then we can go for a bit of a walk.
Yeah, it's named to Jess. So we cover Merseyside, West Lancashire, and the Wirral and bits of Holton and anywhere else we sort of can sneak into without upsetting people. We run about events like this, obviously, fairly regularly, the occasional training workshop, roost visits, and we've got various surveys on the go. We've got transect surveys at Ainsdale on the National Lake Preserve. We do several local wildlife sites, and the nearest one to here, I think it's one in Tarbuck and one is Big Hall, which are a mixture of transect surveys and roost emergence. Similarly, we do stuff at Nosey Safari Park as well, as part of their pat surveys that we do, bat box checks and hibernation surveys in North Wales and parts of Merseyside. So it's quite a lot to get involved with.
Yeah, and there's a lot of experience as well. Like,
Yeah,
the people that are involved in a lot of these back groups have been doing it before you even needed survey licenses, and the legislation was there of just really good naturalists interested in bats and protecting bats.
Subscriptions yearly, it costs you a whole £5.
Yes.
So get the information from our website.
Yeah, so some back groups are free, some will have a small charge, just depending on their structure and insurance and all that kind of stuff. But
Yeah,
that's that they're offering.
So
So
the advantage of being in the back group is you are covered by.
yeah, you are covered by back group insurance that you're doing in like I say, some of these activities with the protection that bats have got, you wouldn't be able to go and do some of the stuff that we've been through and see some of the reason I haven't focused on certain parts of it is because it's not something you can just go and do, but you can do it under the supervision of someone within a back group that is licensed. So if you did want to go forward and delve more into the specifics, it's a really, really good place to do it.